Hey Cloud Engineers, Laura here, and welcome to Modern Infrastructure. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about our Kubernetes templates that we've built here at Pulumi. So, when you're setting up your Kubernetes systems for the first time, you have to set up all of your infrastructure, including all the nodes, all the networking that you need, and you need to set up your actual application, which is getting all your cluster together so that all the pods are running, so that you have everything you need to be able to run your application. We've actually made some different templates here at Pulumi to be able to set up that infrastructure. So we're going to just take those two templates and run them and put them together so that we can have our application on Pulumi. We're going to be using Python today with Poetry. I have a couple things already set up for us. And we're going to be using Google Kubernetes Engine, or GKE, on the Google Cloud. Let's go see what this looks like on our terminal. All right, here we are in the terminal, and we're going to just take a look and see what I already have set up. I've got an application directory or an app directory and an infrastructure directory or an infra directory. These are where I'm going to be running my templates and putting those in here. I've already set up Poetry, so let's see what that looks like. Project.toml. So there's a couple things in here to pay attention to. One, I've already installed Pulumi GCP, and Pulumi Kubernetes in terms of all of my dependencies. And then the other thing is that I do have this package in here for the actual current running directory. We're going to need that when we run our Poetry instance. So just a couple things to keep in mind. But let's head into the app directory and we're going to do an install. So we're going to use the Pulumi new command. And we're going to do this web app dash Kubernetes dash Python. This is the template that we have running. So when I run this, it's going to ask me for some sensible defaults. So in this case, I do want to actually name this template something very specific, just because app isn't going to be really defined enough to be able to do this. So I'm going to call it, let's call it MIK8's app, just for fun. And so we'll call it that, and it's just going to give me a default program here, or project description. I am going to want the dev stack. Now it's going to ask me for a couple things. We don't want to use the default here when it comes to the namespace, because Google Kubernetes Engine, or GKE, is going to have some issues with it. So I'm just going to call it fake-ns for fake namespace. You can call it whatever you want. This is what I chose to use. I only need one replica, and it's just going to go and create the virtual environment. This does take a few moments, so if you're running this on a machine that's might take a little bit longer, it happens. This virtual environment's not going to matter in the end because we're about to delete it. But in case this does take a little bit of time for you, we will take a moment. All right, and after a little bit of movie magic, letting that go and install, we're going to keep moving here. Now, there's a couple things to know. Since I don't need that virtual environment, we're going to actually just remove it. I know it takes a little bit of time to get set up, but this is one of the things with using Poetry. So we don't need the VM, and we don't need requirements.txt either, because we already have that in our Poetry project. So we're just removing those, and now if we take a look what's in here, you'll find we just have the gitignore, the pulumi.dev.yaml, the pulumi.yaml, and the dundermaindunder.py. So let's go up, and we're going to go into the infrastructure directory, and we're about to do the same thing. So we're going to do a Pulumi new, and this one's going to be Kubernetes. Even I can't remember how to spell it sometimes. GCP Python, because we're going to be using Python on both of these. You don't have to. If you choose to use Go for both of these, if you choose to use JavaScript, whatever you want to do. But in this case, I'm using Python because it's a little bit easier for me to do all of the importing. Again, it's going to ask me for some sensible defaults. I'm just going to call this infra MIK8 just for fun. So we're going to do this. We have a stack name of dev. It's going to ask me a couple of different things. So I have this running into Pulumi development, but you need to pull this out of your cluster or your GCP account, your Google Cloud account yourself. This just happens to be the one that I'm working on. So it's my little sandbox. And then I have a region that it's already going to give me. So when I start this up, it's going to go through, I think it asks me one more question or two more questions, and then we have our virtual environment. Yeah, so there's a node per zone and a couple of other things. Once we set up this virtual environment, it's going to take a minute. Let's have some movie magic. All right, and after our little bit of movie magic, we already have the infrastructure directory now ready to go. Again, we're just going to go and remove those old bits of virtual environment and the requirements.txt file because we don't really need that right now. So we're just going to remove those. And we can then take a look at what's in the directory. Again, we just have these little bits and pieces. So let's hop up one directory. Now here's where the fun begins, because we're going to now take everything and put it all together. So the first thing we need to do is get our pulumi.yaml and our pulumi.dev.yaml all set up here in our current directory, in this root directory. By the way, so this is where we are. Whoop, ls-la, that would help. This is where we are right now. The .idea directory is because of my IDE that's been opened in the background. So we have our application directory that is now full, our infrastructure directory that is now full, and our poetry project information. That's our lock file and our actual configuration file, all set and ready to go. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to, touch means just generate a file with nothing in it. And then I want to go and pull out the infra directories pulumi.yaml file. And I just want to put that into the pulumi.yaml file that we have here in this local directory. So this command, all that does is it copies the values out. And one of the things we want to do here, and we will just do it real quick, is we're going to go in here and just delete this virtual environment lines because we don't need it anymore. We're going to be using poetry. So there's that. And then we're also going to pull out all of our .dev configurations that we already had from those sensible defaults. So what we want to do here is a touch pulumi.dev.yaml. And then we're going to take the app directories, pulumi.dev.yaml. And we're also going to take the infra directories, pulumi.dev.yaml, and just dump it into our pulumi.dev.yaml here. So then again, if we take a look at what's here, pulumi.dev.yaml, we'll find all of the configuration values. So we have a little bit of cleaning up to do there. So let's go do that right here in our terminal while we're in here. So we don't need this line. And then the other thing is we don't need these namespaces. Those namespaces are generated every time that you have an application. And in this case, we don't really need them because we're going to be running this all as one program, one project. So the only thing we need is, in terms of name spacing, is this GCP one. Everything else can come out. So we're going to save that. And now we should be just about ready to go through and add in our dundermaindunder.py. So in this case, I'm going to go do this in my IDE just to make it a little bit cleaner and so that you can follow along with what I'm doing. But you also certainly can do this in your terminal if you want to run it there. So let's switch over to the IDE. Okay, and here we are in my IDE. So I've got everything set up just as before, but we want to create a new Python file here in the root of the repo. So it's just going to be main, dunder main. So double underscore is dunder, by the way. Dunder main dunder.py. Whoop, py. There we go. And we're going to use this to import some various bits and pieces. So from Pulumi itself, I actually want to import the export command. And so what I want to do is I'm just going to call that Pulumi as Pulumi underscore export. I want to have that one, and I also want to have the output command, or the output class. I'm going to import that as well. So we're going to have that one in there. Now, from here, we're actually going to import our application code. So import app.main, and I'm going to import that as my app code, just to make things easy. I also want to import my infra main as infra code. Okay, so there's a couple things that we need to do to our application code to make it actually work. But for now, let's start pulling in some bits and pieces. So I'm just going to define a variable infra, and it's going to be the actual infra code itself. So that's now going to run our infrastructure code. From here, I'm going to get a kubeconfig. And that is going to be this infracode dot cluster underscore kubeconfig. Where is that coming from? Let's go take a look. So here in the dunder main dunder.py inside of infrastructure, we have our various bits and pieces getting created. Here's where we get our configuration variables. We create a network, we create a sub network as well, and then we set up our cluster. And with that cluster, we have a service account, a node pool, and then here is the kubeconfig getting built down here at the very, very bottom, and it gets exported right here on line 122. So if you're following along and you're digging around in the code, this is exactly what gets generated with that Pulumi new command. I haven't modified this code at all, so this is what you should exactly see. So we don't need to modify this code specifically. We do need to modify the application code, however. So this application code, if you were running it directly, you would be getting a namespace, a configuration map, which has all of our details about our Nginx config. And then we have our deployment, that's our little web server that's going to be running our Nginx system. And then we have the service that actually exposes everything, along with a couple of exports that you can or cannot use. In this case, we need to wrap it in its own function so that we have a function that we can call in our root dunder main dunder.py. So these are some small changes that we need to do. So first things first, let's make a new function, and let's just call it create app. And we're going to be passing it a kubeconf value that we're going to be passing in here. Let me actually just call it kubeconfig, because then that's a little bit easier for all of us. And then I'm going to take all of these lines and we want to indent them. All right, so everything should be all set to go here. And one thing I'm going to change, that this is one of my things, I am going to rename this and refactor it just because it drives me crazy not to be using snake case. But this is just a me. This is a me thing. So that should now be all set to go. So we have our create app in here, and we're going to be passing in this kubeconfig value. Now we do need to create a context for this, meaning a specific provider that we're going to be using, because we need to pass in a configuration value that's coming in from the outside. You can do that by setting a custom provider. So you're setting up a Kubernetes provider, which is what interprets all the Kubernetes code inside of Pulumi. But we're going to be creating one that is custom that takes in that kubeconfig. So this is this new provider. So create a custom, I'm just going to call it create a provider instance for us to use. Okay, so from here, we're going to just call it new underscore provider. And this is going to be the Kubernetes.provider itself. And I'm just going to call it app provider because it's inside of my app directory. And it's going to be passing in the kubeconfig. This is a property that you're able to pass in. So kubeconfig val in this case. And then one more thing, I want to make sure it's using the correct namespace. And that's that K8 namespace that we already have defined up on line 8. So from here, the one thing you need to do for every single one of these resources is we need to pass in this option to use the Pulumi resource option. We need to specifically use a new provider. So you just put in here, use that new provider. You got to do this for every single one. So we're going to do that real quick. Whoop. Ops. And we have that Pulumi and resource provider or resource options, and then provider in here, and it's new underscore provider. And same thing here, go all the way down to the bottom, and it's opt Pulumi. Whoop. It would help if I could spell Pulumi. I really should be using those type hints a little bit more. It always helps, though, to type things out when you're learning something new instead of relying on your IDE's type hints, just because sometimes you will not learn that muscle memory to be able to type it all out yourself. So it's always good just to work on typing it all out yourself. So if you ever get a chance to just code in Vim, sometimes that can be a really good thing for you. All right, now that we have all of these resource options already in here, there are a couple more things that we need to do. First things first, we do need to modify this service because we need this to be a load balancer type instead of a cluster IP type on Google Kubernetes Engine. Just one of those things that is something you need to remember to do. Load balancer. You certainly can do it as an IP, but then you have to add a lot of stuff. This is the simplest way to modify this specific template to dump me out with an endpoint, which is really what I want out of this template, just for this specific use case. And then last but not least, I need to return something. So in this case, I'm just going to return the web server service. I'm going to return that little piece that comes from there. So that gives me my IP. So web server service dot status, because this is where it is, status dot apply. So this is one of our output applies that we will use to actually take a output, unnest it, so like unwrap it all out and be able to pass it off to something else so that it's ready to go once it's been defined instead of just being a future. So this is just going to be a lambda. And I like to use val as my lambda. That's just kind of my thing. So val load balancer, because I'm looking for the load balancer value. And I want to just get the ingress. Ingress. And I want the first value. Remember, this is 0 indexed. I want the IP from there. So this is what we have to do to make our main code work with app main.py. And again, if you're following along, there should be a GitHub repo that I'll be linking in the description once I have everything all loaded onto YouTube. So here, what we just need to do is finish out writing this code. And we are going to now get the infrastructure app underscore infra. And this is going to be an apply. So kubeconf.apply and lambda. Again, I just use val, it's a thing for value. App.create app. So, should be app underscore code. That's why it's not giving me what I want. App code.create. There it is. And it's looking for that kubeconfig value, remember? So in this case, we're just passing in the value or kubeconfig. There it is. So this is going to return exactly what I want. And then I do have to run one more Pulumi export so that it shows up on my terminal when we're ready to run this. So Pulumi export, and we're just going to call this endpoint URL. And then here we want that app infra. So app underscore infra, because remember, it's already returning the output. I don't really need to put anything else here. It's going to return a string. So this is the one value that I need. Oh, almost. It's going to return it as a secret because reasons. So we're just going to call it unsecret. So if you didn't know, you can hit unsecret. It's not exactly the safest thing, but occasionally this happens with Pulumi. So we're going to say unsecret, meaning take it, unwrap it, and don't return it to me as a secret. So this is that app infra right there. So this is everything we need to be able to take these two templates, wrap them together, and return the entire stack all built. So all of my nodes, my cluster, my networking, all of those pieces alongside the web application itself. Let's go see what exactly this does. You ready? I think I am. Let's go back to my terminal. All right, and we're back in the terminal, ready to go, and we're going to get started here. The one thing we do need to do is actually initialize that stack, because remember, we just copied the values into our system. So we're just going to do a Pulumi stack select dev. and this is going to initialize us, and we're ready to go. So we're going to be running poetry. So we start out with poetry run. You certainly can put this all in an interactive poetry shell. I choose not to. This is just as easy. So poetry run Pulumi up, and this is going to take a little bit once we get going, but I'm just going to show you how it gets started. Note that there's only 6 resources that are getting created, when in reality we have about 9 or 10. It's because of how everything is deeply wrapped on that apply. It's not able to notice what else should be in the resource graph. But we know it's there, so we're going to just hit yes, and away we go. So there'll be a little bit of movie magic here, speeding us all the way through. All right, and there we have it. We have 11 resources created. We have all of our outputs that we need, including that endpoint URL. Let's see what happens. We can actually just curl that. So Pulumi stack output endpoint URL. And notice that I'm passing that in as a variable in bash, or well, in this case it's ZSH, but same rough idea here. So when I curl that, we're going to get back that Nginx homepage, which is the default little homepage that Nginx will send whenever it's all set up and ready to go. So we have our web server ready to change, and now you can go in and start changing all of your application code, and your cluster is up and running. Pretty cool, if you ask me. So always when you're trying something out new like this, make sure that you tear everything down. Make sure you use Pulumi run, or poetry run Pulumi destroy -y. Now, one thing to know is that because our graph wasn't perfect when we did that preview, remember, it didn't have all of our application resources in the graph already. It's not going to know that the resources that are on that cluster are dependent on the cluster itself. So when it starts doing this destroy, what we're going to find is that it's going to delete the cluster sometimes before it actually starts deleting that namespace, and sometimes even the deployment and things like that. You'll note that sometimes that happens. If it does, what you need to do is, as long as the cluster is removed, meaning that the system can no longer talk to the cluster has been deleted, you can actually go into state and remove those pieces for the actual web app that we've generated. So anything that is, while this is going, anything here that says Kubernetes :apps/v1 or core/v1 here on the next line, any of these ones, whoop, not that one, these ones, the ones that say Kubernetes here at the beginning. So if you run into any of those, we can actually see what that one will look like. This delete will take a moment to do. And there we have it, folks. Everything all together to do a Kubernetes cluster just using the Pulumi templates so that you actually have your web app up and running. We will see you soon for another modern infrastructure. Otherwise, please go ahead, check out some of the links down in the description. Be sure to subscribe, and we will see you soon. Take care.